March 24th, 1945, shortly after dawn, somewhere over the German capital, Captain Roscoe Brown grips the controls of his P-51 Mustang, scanning the sky above the bombers he has sworn to protect. Below, the Daimler-Benz tank factory sprawls across the industrial heart of Berlin, churning out the armoured vehicles that Hitler needs to prolong a war already lost. The 1,600-mile round trip from Italy has taken them deeper into enemy territory than any 15th Air Force escort mission before. And now, streaking toward the bomber formation at impossible speed, come the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, Messerschmitt Me 262 jets, history's first operational jet fighters, faster than anything the Allies can put in the sky. Brown sees the streaks, 25 German jets launching from Brandenburg-Brest, climbing toward the vulnerable B-17 seconds with their bomb bays heavy. The pilots of these jets are among the Luftwaffe's best, flying machines that can outrun any propeller-driven aircraft by 100 miles per hour. Every pilot in the formation knows what is about to happen. Every man knows the odds. And every man flying those red-tailed Mustangs is black. The same military that told these pilots they lacked the intelligence to fly combat aircraft. The same generals who predicted they would break under pressure. The same commanders who assigned them obsolete equipment and tried to disband them before they ever saw action. Now those pilots are the only thing standing between the bombers and annihilation. Brown keys his radio. Drop your tanks and follow me. The Tuskegee Airmen dive into the German jets. What happens in the next several minutes will earn the 332nd Fighter Group a Distinguished Unit Citation. 3 German jets will fall from the sky, shot down by pilots flying propeller aircraft against the most advanced technology the Third Reich possesses. Captain Roscoe Brown will become one of the first pilots to shoot down an Me 262 over Berlin. His fellow pilots, Charles Brantley and Earl Lane, will each claim a jet of their own. The bombers will strike their target and turn for home, and the men who were told they could never fly will prove they were among the finest combat pilots in the entire war. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen begins not in the skies over Europe, but in the segregated streets of America, in the military academies where black cadets were silenced, and in the minds of men who refused to accept the lies their country told about them. Benjamin Oliver Davis, Jr. was born December 18, 1912, in Washington, D.C. His father, Benjamin Oliver Davis, Sr., was one of only 2 black combat officers in the entire United States Army at that time. The elder Davis would eventually become the first black general in Army history, but his son would surpass even that achievement. Growing up in a military family meant constant relocation: Arizona, Wyoming, Ohio, the Philippines. Wherever his father was stationed, young Benjamin followed, absorbing the culture of the armed forces while simultaneously experiencing the humiliation of American segregation. He watched his father navigate a system designed to marginalize him, accepting assignments that kept him away from white troops, swallowing indignities that would have broken lesser men. In Cleveland, Ohio, the young Davis attended Central High School, graduating in 1929. He then enrolled at Western Reserve University before transferring to the University of Chicago. But his goal was always the military. His father's path had shown him both the possibilities and the limitations of service for a black man in America's armed forces. In 1932, Benjamin Davis, Jr. received a nomination to the United States Military Academy at West Point from Oscar DePriest, then the only black congressman in America. It was a rare opportunity. Only 3 black men had graduated from West Point in the previous 50 years. Davis was determined to be the 4th. What awaited him was not just academic rigor, but systematic psychological warfare. From his first day at the academy, Davis was subjected to what cadets called the silent treatment. His white classmates refused to speak to him outside of official duties. No one would room with him. He ate every meal alone at a table for one, while hundreds of cadets surrounded him in the mess hall. For 4 years he lived in isolation, shunned by the men who would become his fellow officers. They walked past him without acknowledgement. They refused to sit beside him in class. They pretended he did not exist. The treatment was designed to break him, to make him resign, to prove that black men did not belong at West Point. It was designed to make me buckle, Davis later wrote. But I refused to buckle. They did not understand that I was going to stay there, and I was going to graduate. I was not missing anything by not associating with them. They were missing a great deal by not knowing me. Davis excelled academically. He studied harder than his classmates, knowing that mediocrity was not an option. He endured the silence and the isolation with a dignity that his tormentors could not comprehend. When they expected him to crumble, he stood straighter. In 1936, Benjamin Davis Jr. graduated from West Point, 35th in a class of 276. He was the Academy's first black graduate of the 20th century, 47 years after the previous black graduate. He was also the fourth black graduate in the institution's entire history, stretching back to 1877. Davis requested assignment to the Army Air Corps. He wanted to fly. His application was denied. The Air Corps did not accept black pilots. There were no black squadrons, and white squadrons would not tolerate integration. Instead, Davis was assigned to the 24th Infantry at Fort Benning, Georgia, one of the segregated Buffalo Soldier units where black officers could serve without commanding white troops. The rejection could have ended his dreams. It did not. Davis waited. He served. He was assigned to teach military science at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, the same position his father had held years earlier. And he watched for the moment when opportunity would crack open the door that America had slammed in his face. That moment came in 1941. As war spread across Europe and Asia, pressure mounted on the Roosevelt administration to expand opportunities for black Americans in the military. Civil rights leaders, black newspapers, and activists demanded that if black men were expected to fight for democracy abroad, they should be allowed to serve in all branches of the armed forces. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the nation's most influential black newspapers, launched the Double V campaign, Victory over Fascism Abroad, Victory over Racism at Home. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt became a powerful advocate for integration, using her influence to push for change. She had long championed civil rights causes, and the question of black military service became one of her priorities. In the spring of 1941, Eleanor Roosevelt visited the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama to observe their civilian pilot training program. This program, established in 1939, trained civilian pilots at colleges across the country. Tuskegee was one of 6 black institutions participating, teaching young black men the fundamentals of aviation at a time when the military refused to let them fly. What she saw impressed her. Black men and women were learning to fly, maintaining aircraft, and demonstrating every skill that military aviation required. The program was run by Charles Alfred Anderson, known as Chief Anderson, a pioneering black aviator who had taught himself to fly in the 1920s when no flight school would accept him. Anderson had been the first black American to earn a commercial pilot's license without having to train in Europe. The First Lady asked to take a flight with Chief Anderson. Her Secret Service detail objected strenuously. The idea of the president's wife flying with a black pilot in rural Alabama seemed dangerous on multiple levels. Roosevelt ignored their concerns completely. She climbed into Anderson's yellow Piper J 3-cub trainer and flew over the Alabama countryside. "I always heard Negroes could not fly," Roosevelt told Anderson. "And I wondered if you would mind taking me up." She had the flight photographed deliberately. She brought those photographs back to Washington, and she used them to help convince her husband that the Tuskegee pilots deserved their chance to serve in combat. On March 19, 1941, the Army Air Corps constituted the 99th Pursuit Squadron. It was activated 3 days later at Chanute Field in Illinois, becoming the first black flying squadron in American military history. Over 250 enlisted men began training in aircraft maintenance and support trades. Months later, the squadron transferred to Tuskegee Army Air Field in Alabama, where the serious business of training combat pilots began. Captain Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was assigned to command the first training class. The man who had been denied entry to the Air Corps was now responsible for creating the pilots who would prove that denial wrong. The challenges were immense. Tuskegee was deliberately isolated from other military installations, keeping black trainees separate from white personnel. The nearest town enforced the same brutal segregation that governed civilian life throughout the Deep South. Equipment was often outdated or insufficient. Local white residents viewed the program with suspicion at best, and outright hostility at worst. White commanders cycled through the program, some supportive, many hostile. Colonel Frederick Kimball initially oversaw operations, maintaining strict segregation in deference to local customs. The pilots and ground crews resented this treatment, but had little recourse. Later, Noel Parrish took command and proved far more sympathetic to the airmen's cause. Parrish removed segregation signs from base facilities and petitioned Washington to allow the Tuskegee pilots to serve in combat rather than being relegated to training and support roles indefinitely. The cadets trained harder than their white counterparts at other bases, knowing that any failure would be used to justify the program's termination. They learned to fly in PT-17 Stearman biplanes, the standard primary trainers used throughout the Army Air Forces. They graduated to BT-13 Valiants for basic flight training, mastering more complex maneuvers and instrument flying. Finally, they transitioned to the high-performance AT-6 Texan trainers, aircraft that simulated the characteristics of the combat fighters they would eventually fly. They studied navigation, calculating courses and headings across hundreds of miles. They learned meteorology, reading weather patterns that could mean life or death at altitude. They practiced combat tactics, learning how to engage enemy aircraft in the three-dimensional battlefield of the sky. They memorized aircraft recognition silhouettes, knowing they would have only seconds to distinguish friend from foe. They learned to shoot, to dive, to roll, to fight. The washout rate was high. Cadets who could not meet the standards were eliminated mercilessly. There would be no shortcuts, no accommodations, no excuses. The men who earned their wings would be unquestionably qualified. On March 7, 1942, the first 5 pilots earned their wings. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was among them, finally achieving the goal the Air Corps had denied him 6 years earlier. George Spencer Roberts, Charles DeBow Jr., Mac Ross, and Lemuel Custis completed the class. They were the first black military pilots in American history, but earning wings meant nothing if they were never allowed to use them. The 99th trained and waited. More classes graduated. The squadron grew. Still, no deployment orders came. White commanders in Washington debated whether black pilots could actually perform in combat. Some advocated disbanding the program entirely before it ever reached a battlefield. Others suggested using them only for non-combat roles, coastal patrol over Liberia, or training duties far from the front lines. The arguments against combat deployment echoed the racism that permeated American society. Black men supposedly lacked the intelligence for complex aviation tasks. They supposedly lacked the courage to face enemy fire. They supposedly lacked the reflexes for aerial combat. These claims were presented as scientific fact, backed by studies from universities that had reached their conclusions before examining any evidence. Davis fought these battles in Washington, while his pilots fought frustration in Alabama. He testified before skeptical generals who expected him to fail. He argued that his men deserved the same opportunity to prove themselves that white pilots received automatically. He demanded combat deployment with a quiet intensity that forced his superiors to take him seriously. In April 1943, the 99th Fighter Squadron finally shipped out for North Africa. They traveled aboard the USS Mariposa to Casablanca, Morocco, becoming the first black American flying unit to deploy overseas for combat. They were attached to the 33rd Fighter Group, a white unit whose commanders viewed the black pilots with suspicion at best and outright hostility at worst. Flying obsolete Curtiss P-40 Warhawks while other squadrons received newer aircraft, the 99th prepared to face the Luftwaffe over the Mediterranean. Their first combat missions came in June 1943, supporting the Allied invasion of the island of Pantelleria. This small island, located between Tunisia and Sicily, was heavily fortified by Italian forces. The pilots flew strafing runs and dive bombing missions, attacking enemy positions while enduring anti-aircraft fire. They performed professionally, striking their targets and returning safely. But aerial victories remained elusive. The missions they flew offered few opportunities for air-to-air combat. Then on July 2, 1943, during an escort mission for B-25 medium bombers attacking Castelvetrano Airfield in western Sicily, Lieutenant Charles Hall spotted 2 German Focke-Wulf 190 fighters closing on the vulnerable bombers. It was Hall's 8th combat mission. He had never been close enough to an enemy aircraft to engage. Now 2 of Germany's best fighters were diving toward the planes he was sworn to protect. Hall maneuvered his P-40 between the enemy aircraft and the bombers. He turned inside the German fighters, using the superior turning ability of his aircraft to get one in his gun sights, and opened fire. His rounds tore into the Focke-Wulf. The German fighter burst into flames and plunged toward the ground. It was the first aerial victory for any Tuskegee Airman. The first time a black American combat pilot had shot down an enemy aircraft. It was also the only aerial victory the squadron would score in all of 1943, but it proved that the Tuskegee pilots could fight. General Dwight Eisenhower himself flew to the squadron's base to personally congratulate Hall. The Supreme Allied commander shook the young pilot's hand and told him the country was proud of his achievement. The Chicago Defender and Pittsburgh Courier blazed headlines celebrating the victory. In lieu of champagne, which was unavailable, Hall's squadron mates celebrated by presenting him with the last bottle of Coca-Cola on the base. But the victory was not enough to silence the critics. After the 99th's first months of combat, Colonel William Momyer, commander of the 33rd Fighter Group, sent a damning report to his superiors. He claimed the black pilots were not of the fighting caliber of any squadron in this group. He recommended that the Tuskegee experiment be terminated and the pilots reassigned to non-combat duties. His superior, Major General Edwin House, agreed and forwarded the assessment with his own conclusion. The consensus of opinion seems to be that the Negro type has not the proper reflexes to make a first-class fighter pilot. The report reached the War Department. A study from the University of Texas was submitted as evidence, purporting to prove that black Americans were inherently incapable of handling the demands of aerial combat. The future of black military aviation hung in the balance. Davis was recalled to Washington to defend his pilots before the War Department Committee on Special Troop Policies. He came armed with facts and statistics that contradicted Mommyer's assessment. He pointed out that the 99th had flown far fewer combat hours than the white squadrons it was being compared against. He noted that his pilots had been given difficult ground attack missions, while other squadrons flew the interception duties that produced aerial victories. He documented the discrimination in equipment allocation and mission assignment that handicapped his squadron from the start. He argued that his men had performed exactly as well as any pilots with equivalent experience and opportunities. Given the same chances, they would produce the same results. The failure was not in his pilots but in the system that refused to treat them fairly. Colonel Emmett O'Donnell, a white officer who had observed the 99th in combat, testified in their defense. He told the committee that the black pilots had performed their duties competently and courageously. The committee found no difference in performance between white and black air units. The Tuskegee Airmen would continue to fight. In January 1944, the 99th got its chance to prove the critics catastrophically wrong. Allied forces had landed at Anzio, south of Rome, on January 22nd, establishing a beachhead that was immediately threatened by German counterattacks. The Wehrmacht threw everything available at the Allied position, determined to push the invaders back into the sea. The Luftwaffe sent waves of Focke-Wulf 190 fighter bombers to destroy the troops and ships clustered on the beaches. 8 Allied fighter squadrons scrambled to defend Anzio. Among them was the 99th, now attached to the 79th Fighter Group. On January 27th, German aircraft attacked in force. The 99th intercepted them over the beachhead. In the swirling dogfight that followed, 10 pilots of the squadron shot down 10 enemy aircraft. Captain Lemuel Custis got one. Lieutenant Willie Ashley got one. Lieutenant Howard Ball got 1.5. Lieutenant Robert Dees got one. Lieutenant Leon Roberts got one. Lieutenant Edward Toppins got one. More names joined the list of victorious pilots. It was more enemy aircraft destroyed than any other squadron defending Anzio that day. The next day, the Germans came back. The 99th shot down 3 more, with Captain Charles Hall adding 2 more victories to his tally. In 2 days of intense combat, the Tuskegee Airmen downed 13 enemy aircraft, the highest score among all 8 squadrons involved in the defense. The pilots who supposedly lacked the reflexes for combat had outperformed every white unit fighting alongside them. The news spread through the military and the black press. General Henry Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, praised the squadron's results. General John Cannon, who had previously endorsed the negative reports about the 99th, flew to their base personally. "Keep shooting," he told them as he left. By spring of 1944, the Tuskegee experiment had expanded dramatically. 3 additional black fighter squadrons had been activated, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd. Together with the veteran 99th, they formed the 332nd Fighter Group under the command of now Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. The group moved to Ramitelli Airfield on Italy's Adriatic coast in May 1944. Their mission changed from ground support to heavy bomber escort, protecting the B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators of the 15th Air Force on strategic bombing raids deep into enemy territory. They would attack the industrial heart of the Nazi war machine, targeting oil refineries, tank factories, railroad yards, and aircraft plants across Germany, Austria, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. The group transitioned through several aircraft types. They flew Bell P-39 Airacobras initially, then Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, and finally received the aircraft that would make them famous, the North American P-51 Mustang, the finest American fighter of the war. The pilots painted the tails of their P-51 Mustangs a distinctive bright red. It was meant to help bomber crews identify their escorts, but it became something more. A symbol. A statement. A badge of excellence that would earn them their most famous nickname, Red Tails. Bomber crews learned to recognize and trust those red-tailed Mustangs. Unlike some escort groups that left their bombers to chase individual enemy fighters, the Tuskegee Airmen maintained strict discipline, staying with the heavy bombers through the most dangerous phases of each mission. Word spread through the bomber squadrons. If you wanted to come home, you wanted the Red Tails flying cover. By some reports, bomber crews began specifically requesting the 332nd as their escorts. They called them the Red-Tailed Angels. The German Luftwaffe developed their own name for the pilots who kept appearing over their cities, Schwarze Vogelmenschen, Black Birdmen. On June 9, 1944, Colonel Davis personally led the group on a bomber escort mission to Munich, Germany. Over the Udine area of northeastern Italy, approximately 20 German fighters rose to intercept. In the dogfight that followed, 4 Tuskegee pilots shot down 5 Me-109 seconds. Davis earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for his leadership that day. Through the summer and fall of 1944, the 332nd compiled an extraordinary record. They escorted bombers to targets across southern and central Europe, engaging German fighters whenever the Luftwaffe rose to challenge them. On July 12th, Captain Joseph Ellsbury shot down 3 enemy aircraft in a single mission. On July 18th, the group shot down 12 enemy aircraft in a single day. On October 12th, they downed 9 more. 3 pilots emerged as the group's top scorers: Captain Joseph Ellsbury, Captain Edward Toppins, and Lieutenant Lee Archer. Each claimed 4 confirmed aerial victories, making them the Tuskegee Airmen's leading pilots in air-to-air combat. But individual glory was never the point. The mission was protecting the bombers, bringing them home, proving that black pilots could do the job better than anyone expected. The men who flew these missions were fighting 2 wars simultaneously. Over Europe, they battled the Luftwaffe. At home, they battled the same racism that had nearly killed the program before it began. Even as they distinguished themselves in combat, segregation followed them everywhere. German prisoners of war captured and held in the United States were treated better than black servicemen at some military installations. A local laundry near Freeman Field in Indiana refused to wash the clothes of black officers while willingly laundering the uniforms of captured Nazi soldiers. Officers' clubs remained segregated. Training facilities maintained separate accommodations. The men who risked their lives daily for American democracy returned to bases where they could not eat in the same mess halls or sleep in the same quarters as the white personnel they had just protected in combat. In April 1945, this contradiction exploded into open resistance. At Freeman Field, Indiana, over 100 black officers of the 477th Bombardment Group attempted to enter an officers' club that the base commander had designated whites only. The base commander, Colonel Robert Selway, had established two separate officers, clubs, assigning the better facility to white officers and relegating black officers to an inferior club despite their equivalent rank and status. 101 officers were arrested for refusing to sign a base regulation acknowledging the segregated facilities. They faced potential court-martial for insubordination. Among those arrested were combat veterans who had already proven their courage over Nazi Germany. The Freeman Field Mutiny, as it became known, drew national attention to the absurdity of military segregation. The NAACP, under the direction of Thurgood Marshall, organized the legal defense. Eventually, all but 3 were released without charges. One officer was convicted of a minor offense and fined, but the incident demonstrated that black servicemen would no longer accept second-class citizenship without resistance. Meanwhile, in the skies over Europe, the war was reaching its climax. By March 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Soviet forces pushed from the east. American and British armies advanced from the west. German cities lay in ruins from round-the-clock bombing. But the Luftwaffe could still fight, and its newest weapons represented a technological leap that threatened to turn the tide. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter was years ahead of anything the Allies possessed. Powered by twin Junkers Jumo turbojet engines, it could reach speeds over 540 miles per hour, nearly 150 miles faster than the best American fighters. Armed with 4 30mm cannons, it could shred a heavy bomber with a single pass. If Germany had deployed these jets in sufficient numbers earlier in the war, the outcome might have been different. Now, in the war's final months, the Me-262 flew in defense of the Reich's most vital targets. And the most vital target of all was Berlin. On March 24, 1945, the 15th Air Force launched its longest and most dangerous bomber escort mission of the entire war. The target was the Daimler-Benz tank factory in the German capital. The round trip from Italy covered 1,600 miles, deeper into enemy territory than any previous mission from the Mediterranean theater. The 332nd Fighter Group would provide the escort. 59 red-tailed P-51 Mustangs of the 99th, 100th, and 301st Fighter Squadrons took off from Ramitelli at 9:30 in the morning. The 302nd Fighter Squadron had been inactivated earlier that month. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis personally led the formation. They climbed to altitude and turned north, crossing the Alps and penetrating into the heart of Nazi Germany. 5 aircraft turned back with mechanical problems. The rest pressed on. As the formation approached Berlin, German defenders scrambled to intercept. Jagdgeschwader 7, the Luftwaffe's premier jet unit, launched approximately 25 Me-262 from Brandenburg-Brest. They were joined by propeller-driven Focke-Wulf 190 and rocket-powered Me-163 Comets. It was one of the largest concentrations of German jets the 15th Air Force had ever faced. Captain Roscoe Brown, leading a flight of the 100th Fighter Squadron, spotted the jets first. Streaks at 9 o'clock, climbing toward the bombers. The jets were already moving faster than any propeller aircraft could match in level flight. Brown made an instant calculation. He could not outrun the jets. He could not match their speed in a straight line. But he might outmaneuver them if he caught them climbing, when their speed was lowest and their vulnerability highest. "We knew the German jets were faster than we were," Brown later recalled. "Instead of going directly after them, we went away from them and then turned into their blind spots. Drop your tanks and follow me." The P-51 seconds jettisoned their auxiliary fuel tanks, each one worth the price of a new automobile, and dove toward the German formation. Brown locked onto an Me-262 as it climbed toward the bombers. The jet pilot, focused on his attack run against the heavy bombers, never saw the Mustang diving toward him from above and behind. Brown opened fire. His 650 caliber machine guns hammered rounds into the jet's fuselage. The Me-262 shuddered, trailed smoke, and fell away. Its pilot, Oberleutnant Franz Kulp, a 10 victory ace, bailed out with severe wounds. He would survive but never fly combat again. Minutes later, Lieutenant Charles Brantley caught another Me-262 inches his gun sights and sent it spinning toward the earth. Lieutenant Earl Lane claimed a third. 3 German jets destroyed by pilots flying propeller aircraft that supposedly could not compete with jet technology. The bombers reached their target. The Daimler-Benz factory disappeared under a carpet of explosions. The formation turned for home, the red-tailed Mustangs still circling protectively around the heavy bombers. The mission was not without cost. Captain Armour McDaniel was shot down during the engagement with the jets. Both his legs were fractured during bailout, and he was captured by German forces. He would spend approximately 30 days as a prisoner of war at Stalag VII, near Moosburg, before being liberated by General Patton's Third Army. 9 B-17 bombers were lost to anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters during the raid. But the Tuskegee Airmen had accomplished something extraordinary. They had flown the longest escort mission in 15th Air Force history. They had engaged the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. They had shot down 3 jet fighters, damaged 5 more, and brought the majority of their bombers through to the target. For this mission, the 332nd Fighter Group earned a Distinguished Unit Citation, the highest honor that could be awarded to a combat unit. Combined with the 2 citations the 99th Fighter Squadron had earned earlier for operations over Sicily and at Monastery Hill near Cassino, the Tuskegee Airmen would ultimately receive 3 Distinguished Unit Citations during the war. The news spread quickly. The following day, Roscoe Brown was flown to Rome for a press conference. The 15th Air Force wanted the world to know what the black pilots had accomplished. Brown gave interviews, posed for photographs, and returned to Ramitelli to fly more missions. A week later, on March 31st, the 332nd had its best day for aerial victories. Conducting a fighter sweep over Munich, the pilots encountered German fighters and shot down 13 of them, the highest single-day total in the group's history. The following day they shot down 12 more. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Tuskegee Airmen had compiled a record that spoke for itself. Over 15,000 combat sorties flown. 179 bomber escort missions completed with an outstanding record of protection. 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air and another 150 on the ground. More than 600 railroad cars demolished. 40 boats and barges destroyed. 1 German torpedo boat put out of action by machine gun fire alone. The decorations earned told the story of courage under fire. 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses awarded to pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group alone. 744 air medals and clusters. 14 Bronze Stars. 3 Distinguished Unit Citations. 66 pilots died in combat or training accidents. 32 were captured as prisoners of war. The men who were told they could not fly had compiled one of the finest combat records of any fighter group in the entire war. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. was awarded the Silver Star for a strafing mission into Austria and the Distinguished Flying Cross for the bomber escort mission to Munich. He had personally led 67 combat missions, demonstrating the leadership and courage that silenced his critics at West Point forever. But returning home meant returning to segregation. The war was over, but the fight for equality continued. Black veterans who had risked their lives for democracy came back to a nation that still denied them basic civil rights. They could not vote in many southern states. They could not eat at lunch counters or drink from public water fountains. They could not buy homes in many neighborhoods or attend most colleges. The military that had grudgingly accepted their service remained rigidly segregated. The Tuskegee Airmen did not accept this quietly. Davis became one of the architects of military integration, using the combat record of his pilots to argue that segregation weakened rather than strengthened the armed forces. He helped draft the plans that would eventually transform the military into the most integrated institution in American society. On July 26, 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981. It mandated equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services, without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. The segregated military that had tried to prevent black men from flying combat aircraft was officially over. "I want the job done," Truman told his advisors, "and I want it done in a way so that everyone will be happy to cooperate to get it done." Full integration took years to implement. The Army resisted longest, with Secretary of the Army Kenneth Royal arguing that the Army is not an instrument for social evolution. Truman forced Royal into retirement when he refused to comply with the order. The Korean War accelerated the process. Units that had been rigidly segregated fought side by side when battlefield necessity demanded it. By 1954, the last all-black units were dissolved, their personnel integrated into the unified armed forces. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. continued to break barriers. He became the first black officer to command an Air Force base. He became the first black officer to graduate from the Air War College, the institution that prepared officers for the highest levels of military leadership. He rose to the rank of Lieutenant General, and on December 9, 1998, President Bill Clinton awarded him his 4th star, making him a full general. The cadets who refused to speak to him at West Point lived to see Davis become one of the most decorated officers in Air Force history. Roscoe Brown returned to civilian life and devoted himself to education. He earned a doctorate from New York University and spent decades as a professor and administrator, eventually becoming president of Bronx Community College. He created the Center for Urban Education Policy at the City University of New York Graduate Center. He never stopped telling the story of what the Tuskegee Airmen accomplished, never stopped fighting for the principles they represented. On March 29, 2007, the surviving Tuskegee Airmen gathered in the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C., approximately 300 of them, elderly now, many in wheelchairs, wearing the medals they had earned 6 decades earlier. Their widows joined them for the ceremony. President George W. Bush was there to present them with the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow. The president spoke of his own father, a World War II pilot who had flown with brave young men in the Pacific. But his father's generation, Bush acknowledged, had advantages the Tuskegee Airmen never enjoyed. They never had the burden of having their every mission, their every success, their every failure viewed through the color of their skin, the president said. Nobody told them they were a credit to their race. Nobody refused to return their salutes. He paused. I would like to offer a gesture to help atone for all the unreturned salutes and unforgivable indignities. The President of the United States raised his hand and saluted the Tuskegee Airmen. The old men, the pilots who had flown into the most dangerous skies of the Second World War, who had faced the Luftwaffe's jets and the American military's racism and emerged victorious against both, rose as one, and they saluted back. General Colin Powell, himself a beneficiary of the path the Tuskegee Airmen had cleared, addressed the gathering. I benefited from what you and so many others did, Powell said. I stand so proudly before you today, but I know in the depth of my heart that the only reason I am able to stand proudly before you today is because you stood proudly for America 60 years ago. What does the story of the Tuskegee Airmen tell us about courage, about determination, about what happens when people refuse to accept the limitations others place upon them? It tells us that excellence is indeed the antidote to prejudice. When every mission is scrutinized for failure, when every mistake is used to condemn an entire race, the only response is to be undeniable, to fly so well, fight so hard, protect so faithfully that the lies crumble under the weight of evidence. The Tuskegee Airmen did not ask for easy assignments. They volunteered for the most dangerous missions because they understood that proving themselves required facing the greatest challenges. When the call came for the Berlin mission, 1,600 miles into the heart of enemy territory against jet fighters, they did not hesitate. They dropped their tanks and followed their leaders into combat against impossible odds. They fought knowing that their success would open doors for generations who came after, that every victory in the air was also a victory against the barriers that confined Black Americans on the ground. They carried the weight of their entire people on their wings, and they flew. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. died on July 4, 2002, 89 years old, a 4-star general, one of the most honored officers in Air Force history. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. A red-tailed P-51 Mustang flew over his funeral service, the same type of aircraft he had flown into combat over Nazi Germany. Roscoe Brown died on July 2, 2016, 94 years old, still teaching, still telling the story. The man who shot down a German jet over Berlin spent his final decades ensuring that no one would ever forget what the Tuskegee Airmen accomplished. March 24th, 1945. Somewhere over the German capital, Captain Roscoe Brown grips the controls of his P-51 Mustang. The jets are climbing toward the bombers. 25 of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world against a squadron of propeller planes flown by men whose country told them they could not fly. Brown keys his radio. The words that follow will echo through history. Drop your tanks and follow me. And they follow.